Hello and welcome. This is AdvancingMentalHealth.org's video channel. I'm Jeff Baker. This is a two-part series on the legal aspects of forced psychiatry. It features Gary Brown. Gary's an attorney who for over 30 years has dedicated his practice to representing people who have been captured, put into a psychiatric hospital against their will, and want to be released. In this Part 1, Gary talks about the need to change the way we look at forced psychiatric treatment. He questions the widely accepted narratives used to justify it and measures them against the current laws as well as our constitutional principles of liberty. In Part 2, Gary will talk about the legal steps that need to be followed in order to forcibly treat someone. Gary Brown's experience in this area provides us with a seasoned legal perspective on forced psychiatry that few people can offer. We encourage you to watch both parts to get the full picture. Here's Gary Brown, Part 1.
I need to back up and explain some basic ideas to everybody who's listening. Psychiatry is a particular aspect of the field of medicine. That's the way it's been framed for many years. It's physicians who've gone on to specialize in an area called the mind or mental, and they are simply what common people call doctors. But our rights to be free people in our nation, such as America and other nations that follow similar principles, are based upon a basic notion of liberty. And we don't have medicine forced on us in an environment of liberty. We can choose it, and only under limited circumstances like dire emergency will somebody use medicine on a person who's not able to make conscious choices, like if you're in a terrible accident or so forth. So let's back up a moment and realize what's really going on here and how we have been led into describing it wrong because we've been taught to think about it wrong. The basic principle in America, for example, and I'm in California where I've been practicing law for 45 years and working in the mental area for now a little over 30 years. The basic principle is what we call liberty. And we very often use the word freedom, which is the outcome of liberty properly exercised. In other words, two nice people can live next door to each other and have different ideas about correct behavior. And the first thing we do is we expect the decency of good people to accommodate each other. And that's how we find freedom to be with each other in a peaceful way. We only involve government when we need to make a rule because not enough people are doing things the right way. And the rules about conduct typically are found in the penal code. Those are things that we consider to be so wrong that we don't want to see them happening, and we're willing to capture people because they did it, put them in front of a judge and jury to decide whether they actually did it, and the judge then decides what the consequences will be, and there are a myriad of them. Where the idea of mental comes in is from a different angle. If we look back at the history of this planet and all the things that have been said about societies and people, we will always find stories about people who are upset and not ordinary. And they will be called many different names. They're under many different but similar categories. And the most common word we're accustomed to is crazy. And the most common word we're accustomed to historically is a lunatic. Luna coming from the moon. Moods. We recognized that people could have moods and that their behavior could be unacceptable, and we have a long history of this. Now, obviously, I'm simplifying something that has many more components to it. But we also know, for example, in California, that a law was enacted in the beginning of the establishment of California in the 1800s, 1897 specifically, called the Lunacy Act. Yes, it was called the Lunacy Act. And the Lunacy Act provided for people to be taken to places called asylums. So lunatics were taken to asylums. The method that was used to do that was the agreement of two physicians, and they didn't require them to be specializing in psychiatry. Two physicians would certify that a person needed to be locked up in an asylum. Well, the Supreme Court in California in 1903, in a very important case that regrettably is being forgotten, named N. Ray Lambert, said that method is unacceptable. You can't have physicians decide to lock people up because of the way they believe they think. And that sets the stage for important principles about liberty and freedom in America. Let me explain further. When our country was first founded, the people that came here because they were persecuted. They were having a very hard time living the life they wanted to choose in the countries that they came from, primarily England at that time. Some from other countries, but we know that, and historians can describe this more elaborately than I am. And when they came here, their primary interest was to be able to think the way they wanted to think. And they called that freedom, to think freely. And the primary impediment at that time was something called religion. The religions that people wanted to follow and they sincerely believed in were being discounted and discredited in their homelands. And they had to run away, to flee, to find their freedom. So that became the topic that everybody talked about. And when our country was founded, that was the important topic that was being talked about. The important concept was they didn't want to allow a government to tell them how to think. And when Thomas Jefferson explained this principle to the Virginia Assembly, he explained it in terms of the difference between a person who talked about believing in 20 gods, causing him no harm, even though he didn't agree with that person, versus somebody who touched him offensively on the arm, which he said was legitimately the right of government to control. In other words, conduct can be controlled by government, not thinking.
Okay.
Now, they were talking about religion back then because the predominant problem they were solving wasn't about lunacy at that time, because in those days, every town had its person who later affectionately became the town fool or other similar names to describe somebody whose antics were not acceptable but were tolerated because they were understood to be abnormal. Now we come forward and we find ourselves in the midst of a philosophy being promoted that people who don't think in a normal fashion somehow should be subject to government control. And that's not even how the law is written. The law is written that people can only be subject to government control if initially their conduct is unacceptable. So where I'm going with this is that the basic idea of when a person can be captured has been twisted. And we need to understand that the law is actually written in a fashion where the person's conduct is supposed to be drawing attention to them, and then out of some interesting idea considered kindness or leniency, I'm not sure which, because I think both are wrong, they are diverted to the mental system and taken out of the judicial criminal system. So let me explain that a bit further. In California, as is the case in most states, but I don't know them all, so I can't say for sure. In California, there are 3 characteristics that can place a person in a position of being subject to capture because of their conduct. The first is serious danger of harm to themselves. The second is serious danger of harm to somebody else. And the third is gravely disabled. And that means, and the statute says so in plain words, you have to not be able to take care of yourself. That's shelter, food, and health care. And the United States Supreme Court has already said that if somebody else will help you do it, you're not technically gravely disabled, so you can't be captured. But the point is, these 3 characteristics have to be present before we ask ourselves, is it due to a mental disorder? We don't start with, oh, the person is thinking weird. We don't start with, they don't make any sense. We don't start with, they're wandering around talking to themselves. That is not the legal way, and that is not correct. And legally, that is a denial of liberty. Now, I grant you, if your loved one or a dear friend is wandering around talking to themselves and you can't have meaningful communication with them, you may want to intervene and help them. But that's not the government's job. That's not the job of a stranger, whether it be a policeman or a nurse or a social worker or a psychologist or a psychiatrist. That's not their job. And they especially get it wrong when you think of all the cultures we have in this society, when you think of all the different things that people are being taught on the internet and on television and so forth, all the different methods they have for thinking and coming up with ideas. We don't have any book that actually correctly describes the relationship between a person's thinking and their conduct to be expected. That's the big point, you see? So we don't start off by saying, oh, we're being kind to them because they're not thinking right. That's not the government's job. Factually, fundamentally, that is an illegal approach, and it is being used too often, and it is a common mistake that in my 30 years looking in the mental area, I've seen it over and over and over. So much attention is placed on whether the person seems not ordinary. And in California, the term is bizarre. And what I have to say, Jeff, is, gee, since I was a young lawyer, I'm accustomed to walking into the courthouse downtown Los Angeles and seeing all kinds of people hanging around the courthouse who I wouldn't want to invite home for dinner or go out to lunch with, but they're alive and they're in my free country, and I'm not going to bother them. And they can be babbling, and they can be unkempt, and they can have different ideas, and they can be talking to somebody who is in their imagination, and we won't bother them. And if we want to help them, we, as an attorney, I think, gee, it would be nice if some group that cared about people would come and maybe have a communication with that person, whether it be a church group or a synagogue or a mosque or however that plays out in terms of religion, or a social group that has evolved through charitable institutions on our planet. But we never think of sending a policeman out to lock somebody up. So the point is, we need to get back to the correct approach to what we're doing. The mental system was set up to divert 3 types of behavior. And I want to get into a topic here that may be a little bit surprising to people. You can't divert a person who's gravely disabled, because I don't know of any law that makes that a crime. So they had to create a mental law to make gravely disabled something you can lock up. You get the wrongness of that in a free society? That's what social welfare was developed for. If you look back at the history of the development of social welfare and the schools of social welfare, they were designed to bring help to people having temporary problems in life. And they've been since captured by psychology and turned into a manner or approach of looking at the mental approach of the people instead of the need for help. And I'm saying the government shouldn't be in that job, because the government gets it wrong, in my opinion, every single time. And I'll get into that separately as we look at remedies.
Okay.
The second thing that is characteristic of a person that can be captured is that they're going to be harmful to themselves. Well, look, what I'm about to say is not because I'm admiring it or praising it, but suicide is not illegal in California. What right does the government have to capture a person acting alone, not with the help of anybody else, because nobody can help a person commit suicide. That is illegal. But what right does the government have to capture a person who threatens to do the very thing that's not illegal? Now, mind you, I am not promoting suicide. I happen to be of the view, which is historically the most common view, that a person considering suicide is suffering a spiritual dilemma. It's a religious problem, and they need help, but it doesn't come from the government. So now I've eliminated 2 of the 3 characteristics that give rise to the right to capture people for doing things that supposedly arise because they have a severe mental disorder. The third one is harming others. Now, I certainly don't disagree. I put it simply, I agree that harming others is not okay. And we have crimes for it, starting from assault and battery. Assault being threatening with the present ability to carry it out. So if I'm on the telephone calling you up and telling you I want to punch you in the nose, you can probably figure out that I can't reach your nose. You may decide that I may want to come over and you may want to alert the police. That's all well and good. But certainly you don't sincerely believe that my fist can reach your nose through the telephone. So we need to understand what an assault is. But in the mental area, when 2 kids who thought they were in love with each other break up because maybe one decided somebody else was more attractive and went out and had an affair, the one whose feelings are hurt may yell out, "I want to kill you," or "I want to kill myself." And that gets used as a reason to lock somebody up. That doesn't impress me as correct as a matter of policy, and certainly not correct as a matter of law, and certainly not consistent with the liberty interest of freedom of thought and freedom of expression. In other words, we do have to protect people. I'm not ignoring the possibility that there are instances where threats can be quite serious, quite imminent. Imminent is the key word. In fact, Wisconsin, who is considered sometimes the leader in the field of mental issues, even in its own manuals talks about imminent. California, the decisions say it has to be recent events and it has to be real. One has to reasonably believe it's going to occur. So my point is, the mental laws have stretched too far. The government shouldn't be involved in them. And there are many other problems that we have to talk about. But the first thing I wanted to do was adjust, at least from my perspective, the way we're looking at it. Because once we buy into the false explanation of why we're doing it, we're trapped in a series of reasons and explanations that are untrue and don't fit our constitutional principle of liberty.
Thanks for watching. If you like our content, subscribe. We'll keep you posted as we add new videos. Here at advancingmentalhealth.org, we only have one purpose, and that is to supply information and resources that can help produce better outcomes. Thanks. We'll see you next time.